Today, I would like to talk about metabolism in cancer cachexia and endurance exercise. So the framework within which I think about cancer, and I think about cancer a lot, is that cancer doesn't invent anything. All the key features have some kind of a normal equivalent, either manifested out of context, or it's a process that starts normally but doesn't end. And the two contexts within which I usually find these normal equivalents is either wound healing or fetal development. Examples are for wound healing, for example, pathological angiogenesis. Normal wound healing starts normal, does not end, becomes pathological. Or transient immune suppression that is supposed to be transient during fetal development, but does not end as a tumor, quote unquote, pretends, for example, to be a fetus. But one area, one feature that's been driving me crazy has been cancer cachexia. What is the normal equivalent to cancer cachexia? So a bit of a background on what that is. Cachexia comes from kakos means bad and hexos means condition or state of being. And it is a wasting syndrome characteristic of advanced disease. It doesn't only happen in cancer, it also happens, for example, in advanced cardiac failure. But specifically in cancer, depending on tumor type, it can occur in 30 to 80% of patients. And it is characterized by weight loss, anorexia, anemia, inflammation, and metabolic derangement. Of course, the prime suspect for a normal equivalent to cachexia is starvation, but everywhere I looked, the biomarkers and key features seem to be different. And then I found this fantastic figure in this paper by Olson et al., the citation is in the bottom, that really outlined the comparison and contrast between the two. So for example, in terms of ingestive behavior, when you're starving, you get hungry. When you're cachectic, you do not want to eat, you get anorexic. In terms of movement, when you're starving, you want to move and find food. When you're cachectic, you're very tired. Now this part, in terms of fuel utilization, that was very interesting. So in tissue catabolism, so catabolism means breaking down. In starvation, you use up your fat and you have delayed muscle catabolism. But in cachexia, you have the opposite. You actually have accelerated muscle catabolism. Interesting. And then this bottom one was particularly interesting to me because so this is the resting metabolic rate, which goes down in starvation because you want to preserve your energy, but it seems to be going up in cachexia. So my hypothesis is, what if the normal equivalent to cancer cachexia, that is gone out of balance or starts normally and doesn't end, is actually endurance exercise? And so this is my hypothesis, that systemic cancer creates a chronic resource drain on the body that results in the same metabolic adaptations and patterns of nutrient consumption that are supposed to be transient during strenuous physical activity. That is as if the body starts running a marathon and just does not stop. Okay, so before I dive into kind of exploring this hypothesis, let's review metabolism and exercise. So relative nutrient depletion as a function of effort is usually studied with a device called an indirect calorimeter. It's like this bicycle with the user wearing a tightly fitting mask that has these plastic tubes sticking out of it measuring respiratory gas exchange. You progressively increase effort, like on a treadmill test, and then through these tubes and with this mask, you measure consumed oxygen and exhaled carbon dioxide. And from these measurements, you can calculate corresponding oxidation of carbohydrates and fats using a formula from this 1983 paper by Frayne. Okay, so now the key experiment that kind of had this whole thing snapped together. In 2018, San Millan and Brooks published a very interesting study where they measured relative nutrient consumption in professional athletes, moderately active individuals, and individuals with metabolic syndrome. The experiment design was there was some warm-up period up to particular resistance, particular effort, and then the users were progressively increasing resistance on their bicycles to exhaustion. They were wearing these big masks with the tube sticking out, and the authors would record and then calculate corresponding fat oxidation and carbohydrate oxidation, as well as blood lactate as a function of power output. So blood lactate would then indicate where you are using primarily oxygen, so aerobic metabolism, as to where you're starting to switch over to glycolysis. Okay, let's kind of take a first look at the outputs that they have, and I'm going to dive into them a little bit later. So on the x-axis, you have power output. So this is the data for professional athletes. These curves generally would look the same for all three groups, but just the x-axis would be very different for us mere mortals, be much smaller numbers than it is for professional athletes. So here we have carbohydrate oxidation. So, okay, that as the effort increases, the carbohydrate oxidation increases. And then you have fat oxidation. Okay, so you're starting to you increase your effort, and then at some point you peak in your fat oxidation and goes down, and actually becomes negligible. That's interesting. And so this plot, okay, once again, power output in watts on the x-axis. So on this y-axis, you still have the same carbohydrate oxidation. So same plot as before. But look at what happens in blood lactate. Okay, it stays flat, flat, flat until a certain point, and then it starts going up pretty rapidly. Okay, so that's interesting. We're going to go through this now in a little more detail. Because what we see in these graphs is so-called metabolic switch points. So there are these things that I learned about that are called ventilatory thresholds. These are points for quote-unquote switching between your preferred fuels, in this case carbohydrates or fats, as a function of effort, as a function of exercise intensity. So VT1 is when your breathing rate increases, but you can still hold a conversation. You've heard about that, I'm sure. Here you're using both carbs and fats, and that peaks around this part over here. So when your fat oxidation goes up and then starts going down. So this is treated as your first ventilatory threshold. Keep that in mind, we're going to use this. And then VT2 is when fatty acid oxidation is no longer sufficient. So you start really kicking up carb metabolism, first aerobic and then anaerobic. And that's when we start seeing this rapid change in blood lactate. So usually you start noticing that you've kind of passed this threshold. Typical level of lactate is 2 millimoles per liter. And this is where we would argue that, okay, at this intensity, so at about 300 watts here, these athletes approximately had the switch occur at 300 watts. And the first switch, the ventilatory threshold here, occurred at about maybe 240 watts. Okay, so keeping that in mind. And then, of course, you have your VO2 max is when your incremental increase in exercise intensity no longer increases oxygen consumption. That's where usually most of us just physically cannot keep going and really need to stop. So if we were to kind of rewrite this like this, so on the x-axis I have exercise intensity, on the y-axis I have ventilation. Okay, so if your intensity kind of stays below VT1, it's kind of light intensity, and you're using fat as your primary source of fuel. So relative to carbohydrates. Now you pass VT1, so this, again, in the previous graph, I think there was about 240 watts. So that's moderate intensity. You have noticeable increase in blood lactate. Here you're using both fat and carbohydrates. Okay, and then exercise intensity increases. You surpass the threshold VT2. That is when lactate starts finally going up. That's high intensity. You're using carbohydrates as your primary source of fuel. Fat metabolism really goes down, and then you go to VO2 max, and then you collapse because this is really hard. Okay, so my hypothesis is that, actually, one more point, people with metabolic syndrome actually live close to this VT1 threshold. So incremental activity actually reduces their fat metabolism, fat oxidation. So they might be here, and incremental activity puts them in here. So that's a thing that can happen, and so that sets up the stage for my hypothesis. What if baseline, so where you are relative to these, increases as a function of disease burden? Very much like maybe people with metabolic syndrome. What if this is also an adaptation or something that happens to the body when the disease burden increases? You may be starting here and there and there. And what if actually when people have cachexia, What if they're maybe somewhere over here, or maybe somewhere over here even they're stuck? The transient behavior that becomes permanent. So that's a hypothesis. Okay, so I'm a modeler. The next thing I need to do is quantify the data from this paper by San Millan and Brooks. So I created a mathematical model to quantify this relationship between effort and fat or carb oxidation. My model includes these VT1s and VT2s, which I essentially read off of the data graphs as I showed you before. And the model describes phenomenologically, it's not mechanistic, but still the observed dynamics of ventilatory oxygen and carbon dioxide. And then once I describe those, then I back calculate the corresponding oxidated carbs and fats using the formula by Frame, which I showed you before. Okay, so what does this look like? Okay, so top panel, that's my data for professional athletes. Middle one is moderately active individuals, and the bottom one is metabolic syndrome. It's the same model everywhere, but the difference is where the thresholds are. So again, I said I read them off of the graphs that were published in the paper. So for these guys, yes, it was around 240 and 300. So for moderately active ones, you just scores much lower. And then for people with metabolic syndrome, it's even lower. And I'm simulating the just increase in effort. And then I am simulating, so I'm finding the parameters that will capture my data for ventilatory oxygen consumption and VCO2 consumption. Essentially what I have is I have one rate of depletion or one rate of change for VO2 when you're below VT1, another one when it's between VT1 and VT2, and a third one above VT2. And same thing for carbon dioxide. And then I back calculate my carbohydrate oxidation and fat oxidation. So, okay, so this actually looks pretty good. One model, just very small modifications in parameters, and can capture the available data pretty well. So this is now something we can use to evaluate what would happen in a world where my assumptions were true. My hypothesis that what if in advanced cancer metabolism gets quote unquote stuck between thresholds? Okay, if you remember this. So assume normally you're around here. Now, what if you end up over here or maybe over here? What would happen? What would we expect in terms of nutrient consumption patterns? So these are the results. Okay, let's look at this in detail. So the blue one is my simulated effort is stuck between VT1 and VT2. And the red one is when my simulated effort is above VT2. Okay, so what do we have? So in carbohydrates versus fats. So for the blue line, which is VT1, VT2, stuck between the two, okay, you're still consuming both nutrients. So in this case, at least relative to this case, you are consuming fewer carbs and more fats. And of course, if I were to include the baseline case below VT1, it would be, again, even fewer carbs here and even more fats here. Okay, and then if I were to get stuck above this VT2, well, my carbs go up and my fat oxidation just really becomes completely negligible. And this also, at this stage, you would also expect to see high blood lactate. I didn't model that, but this would be the expectation based, of course, on carbohydrate consumption. So the proposal is maybe actually this is something that could be happening. Maybe in advanced cachexia, metabolism does get quote unquote stuck above VT1, or at least is so close to it that marginal increases in effort you really put you over here. And I even saw some mouse experiments from the lab of Eileen White that show that carb stores are depleted first. And also a lot of experiments showing in cachexia there's elevated lactate. So there is some evidence or some observations that would be predicted by this model, but of course this remains to be evaluated experimentally. But in a world where this is true, the picture could be something like this. So in normal metabolism, your baseline is below VT1, moderate activity, okay, maybe you are going between here and then going back to baseline. And then for maybe intense exercise, you're going over here, primarily carbs, and then still going back down to your baseline. But if you have abnormal cachectic metabolism, maybe your baseline is higher. So you are really working through your fat and carbs moderate activity already puts you into maybe consuming primarily carbs. And once you run out of those, once you run out of your glycogen and all of those things, maybe you start breaking down your muscles. Again, in a world where this is true, could we find early signs of cachexia within this framework? Like metabolic thresholds also are not static. They can be monitored. They can be trained. There's Inigo San Millan is advocating a lot of the zone 2 training to increase mitochondrial capacity. For most people, that is a brisk walk. Maybe that is something that actually could elevate this VT1. There are also wearables. There is this cool shirt that I actually have tried, TimeWear. That's a shirt that measures threshold without indirect calorimetry. It's pretty cool. There are breathable devices that I've seen. Never tried that, but I've seen examples that assess respiratory gas exchanges. Maybe that is something that might be included in trying to figure out what is happening with metabolism in terms of this metabolic flexibility, relative consumption of carbs and fats as a function of disease progression. Maybe we can catch some patterns. Maybe improving mitochondrial function can be a part of treatment. Again, I just found this one case study, again by Inigo San Millan, but they were using individualized exercise prescription to target oxidative metabolism in stage 4 colorectal metastatic cancer patient. With this particular person, they designed basically an exercise regimen that is specific to this particular to his particular thresholds, and at least in this one particular case, that worked pretty well. Maybe that is something that can be part of therapy. A couple of more thoughts, like this one came from a reviewer. They asked me about obesity paradox, which is an excellent question, because obesity paradox, if you look it up, it's when high BMI seems to have protective effect from mortality, at least for a little bit. Hazard ratio around here is actually lower, and then again it increases. That makes no sense. Well, it actually does make sense because this is likely a confounder. Because if you think about when people lose a lot of weight, many people lose it as a result of very severe disease. And rapid weight loss often comes with a lot of muscle loss. That could be important because, for example, in this study by Gonzalez et al., they reported, it's one of an observational study, but still, 175 cancer patients. So they assessed their body composition before chemo, and they showed that the obesity paradox is present only when obesity is defined using BMI. But if you correct for body composition, then obesity predicted higher survival only in the absence of sarcopenia, low muscle mass. So maybe it is sarcopenia that is an independent predictor of higher mortality rather than BMI, and that is a covariate of severe weight loss here, for example. Something to think about. Another kind of a side thought, but I thought it was pretty interesting, because it is always interesting to look, do we have any kind of natural experiments? So the only one that is kind of closely maybe could be interpreted as an example of death by exercise-induced cachexia that I found is that of Henry Worsley. So he attempted to complete the first unaided solo crossing of the Antarctic, trying to complete the entire 1,100-mile continental crossing by himself. And according to description of the trek in this very cool books by Alex Hutchinson, Endure, so his access to near instantaneous help allowed him to push much closer to the margins of his capabilities. Empty his tank day after day, struggling through the snow for 12, 14, 16 hours to ignore increasing weakness and 50-pound weight loss. And then finally, on the 70th day of travel, he called for help. He was picked up. He was taken to a hospital in Chile to be treated for exhaustion and dehydration. But then he got diagnosed with bacterial peritonitis and rushed to surgery, and then he died of widespread organ failure. So my understanding is cachectic patients, they essentially eventually succumb to organ failure. I am wondering if this is an example of actually exercising in cachexia and what happened to this person. Something to think about, evaluate, maybe somebody knows. If you do, let me know. Okay, well, thank you for your attention. Reach out if you have any questions, if you have experiments, if you can run experiments, if you want to discuss experiments, any kind of data scientific conversations are always very exciting and very welcome. Thank you very much.